If you went to high school in the United States in roughly the last 70 years, there's a very good chance you took a test called the SAT. Maybe you took it once. Maybe you took it 3 times trying to push your score up by 50 points. Maybe you spent months studying for it, your parents paid for an expensive prep course, you bought one of those gigantic Princeton review books that weighed about 10 pounds, and that you carried around like a textbook for half a year. Maybe you remember the exact morning you took it. The number 2 pencils. The bubble sheet. The proctor at the front of a high school gymnasium or classroom holding a stopwatch saying, "You may begin." 3 hours of your life and the many hours prior that, when you finished, generated a single number that would help determine which colleges you could get into, which scholarships you might win, which schools would even bother to look at your application. For most of the past century, your SAT score was one of the most consequential numbers in your life, more important than your grade point average, your athletic record, and more than anything you'd written, anything you'd built, anything you'd done. 3 hours. One number. And your life depends on it. Now I want you to think about something. Who invented this test? When did it appear? Why does it ask the questions it asks? Why has it become so central to American education? When was the last time you actually thought about the origins of this test that may have shaped your life? The SAT was invented in 1926 by a Princeton psychologist named Carl Brigham. Brigham was a eugenicist who sat on the advisory council of the American Eugenics Society. His most famous book, published in 1923, was a defense of the idea that white Americans of Northern European descent were intellectually superior to other racial groups. He wrote that intelligence testing would prove the racial superiority of white Americans and prevent what he called, and I quote, "the continued propagation of defective strains in the present population." His work was used to pass one of the most restrictive immigration laws in American history. He created the SAT, in significant part, as a tool to identify and quantify what he believed were innate, biological, racial differences in intelligence. To his credit, he later, partially, recanted these views. He admitted that his original work had been a glorious fallacy, but the test he built lived on. It became the dominant measure of American academic potential for the next 100 years. It defined college admissions. It shaped American higher education. It influenced the trajectories of tens of millions of lives. And almost nobody who has ever taken this test has been told the story of where it came from. The story starts with World War I. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the American military faced a problem. Hundreds of thousands of men were being drafted very fast, and the military needed a way to sort them quickly. Who should be officers? Who should be enlisted soldiers? Who was capable of complex tasks like communications or technical work? Who should be assigned to the most physically demanding and unskilled jobs? The Army turned to what was, at the time, a fairly new field called psychometrics, the science of measuring mental ability. A group of American psychologists, led by figures like Robert Yerkes of Harvard and Lewis Terman of Stanford, was brought in to develop standardized tests that could be administered to massive numbers of soldiers efficiently. The tests they developed were called Army Alpha and Army Beta. Army Alpha was for soldiers who could read English. Army Beta was for soldiers who could not, either because they were illiterate or because English wasn't their first language. The tests measured various cognitive abilities through multiple choice questions, picture analysis, number sequences, and basic problem solving. About 1.7 million American soldiers took these tests between 1917 and 1919. This was, by an enormous margin, the largest psychological experiment in human history up to that point. And the results, the scores, the demographic data, the patterns, became a treasure trove for American psychologists to analyze. How that data was interpreted, and the political conclusions drawn from it, would shape American society for the next 100 years. The man most responsible for that interpretation was a young Princeton psychologist named Carl Brigham. Brigham was born on May 4, 1890, in Marlborough, Massachusetts. His family had deep New England roots, descended from Mayflower-era settlers, and enriched by a gold rush profiting grandfather. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees all at Princeton, finishing his doctorate in 1916. When America entered World War I, he became part of the Army Alpha testing program, working under Robert Yerkes. After the war, Brigham was given access to the full Army Alpha dataset, including the demographic data on which soldiers had taken the test. He spent several years analyzing this data, and in 1923 he published a book called A Study of American Intelligence. Brigham analyzed the Army Alpha scores by ethnic and national origin of the soldiers. He found, or claimed to find, that soldiers of Northern European descent, which he called the Nordic race, scored higher on average than soldiers of Southern European, Eastern European, African, or other backgrounds. From this, he concluded that there were innate, biological, racial differences in intelligence. He didn't stop at conclusions, he made policy recommendations. He argued that the influx of Southern and Eastern European immigrants to the United States, which had been ongoing since the 1880s, was actively lowering the average intelligence of the American population. He argued that this trend would continue, that American intellectual life would decline as immigrant populations grew, and that immigration policy needed to be restructured to prefer immigrants from Northern European countries. He wrote that tests like the Army Alpha would prove the racial superiority of white Americans and prevent, in his own words, the continued propagation of defective strains in the present population. The Army Alpha test relied heavily on knowledge of American culture, idioms, and slang that recent immigrants simply could not have known. Test questions referenced specific American products, sports figures, geographic features, and pop culture references. A brilliant Italian or Polish immigrant who had been in the United States for 2 years would not know the answer to a question about, say, a famous American baseball player or a regional American food product. None of this had anything to do with intelligence. It had to do with cultural familiarity. Brigham and his contemporaries either did not understand this or did not care. They interpreted lower test scores as evidence of lower intelligence, and lower intelligence as evidence of innate racial differences. The political consequences were immediate and enormous. Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the National Origins Act, or sometimes the Johnson-Reed Act. It was one of the most restrictive immigration laws in American history. The law established quotas for each country of origin based on the proportion of that country's immigrants already in the United States, as of 1890. This dramatically favored immigrants from Northern European countries like Britain and Germany, and severely cut immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Italy, Poland, Greece, Russia, and the Balkan states. It effectively banned immigration from most of Asia entirely. The congressional testimony in support of the 1924 Act drew directly on Brigham's book. The chief witness in support of the legislation was a man named Harry Laughlin, an avowed eugenicist who was the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office. Laughlin used Brigham's analysis as the central scientific authority for his testimony. The Army Alpha scores, filtered through Brigham's interpretation, became, in effect, the scientific justification for the racial hierarchies built into American immigration law. The 1924 Immigration Act remained the basis of American immigration policy for the next 41 years, until it was finally replaced by the Hart-Celler Act in 1965. For 4 decades, American immigration was shaped by a book that argued, based on culturally biased tests of soldiers, that some races were intellectually inferior to others. The 1924 Immigration Act, by the way, is the law that turned away the SS St. Louis in 1939. The ship was carrying 937 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. They were refused entry to the United States because the German quota was full. The ship returned to Europe. Of those passengers, an estimated 254 eventually died in the Holocaust. The consequences of Brigham's science reached very, very far. But Brigham himself was not done. Having published his book in 1923, he turned his attention to the next opportunity for psychometric testing: American higher education. In the 1920s, American universities had no standardized way of comparing applicants from different high schools. Each high school had its own curriculum, its own grading standards, its own teachers. A student who got straight A's at a rigorous New England prep school was being compared to a student who got straight A's at a public high school in the rural Midwest. The universities, especially the elite Eastern ones, wanted a way to standardize comparisons. They wanted, essentially, a single instrument that could measure all American teenagers on the same scale. Brigham saw an opportunity. By 1925, he had developed his own college admissions test, called the Princeton Test. In 1926, the College Board, which was at that point a relatively small organization coordinating admissions for a few dozen Eastern elite colleges, commissioned him to lead the development of a new universal test. Brigham took the Army Alpha test, removed some of the most obvious cultural references, and adapted it for high school students. He called the new test the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT. On June 23, 1926, the first SAT was administered to 8,040 high school students at 318 testing centers across 353 locations. 60% of the test takers were male. Each candidate received a practice booklet a week beforehand to help them prepare. The test consisted of 9 separate subtests: definitions, arithmetical problems, classification, artificial language, antonyms, number series, analogies, logical inference, and paragraph reading. Of the men who took that first test, the largest share, 26%, were applying to Yale. Of the women, 27% were applying to Smith College. I want to actually show you some of the questions from that first 1926 SAT. This was subtest 2, the number series. The instructions read, in each line the numbers are arranged in accordance with some particular scheme. Write in the spaces at the margin the 2 numbers that should come next. The 1926 SAT was a brutal 3-hour paper and pencil grind. Take a moment with those questions. Pause if you want. Try to solve them. The students taking this in 1926 had to do these calculations in their heads, on paper, against a clock, with no calculator. Here was another section. Subtest 4. Classification. The instructions read, each group contains 6 words. 3 of these are related to each other in some definite way. Indicate which 3 are most closely related. Take a second. Look at those questions. Some are easier than others. The toys one is easy, the card games, the furniture. Most modern teenagers have no idea what a stoker is. A stoker is a person who shovels coal into a furnace. A milliner is a person who makes hats. The test assumed that the test taker would know them. And here's the thing that becomes clear once you actually look at the original test. The questions were not testing some abstract, universal, culture-free cognitive ability. They were testing whether you came from a particular cultural background. A 1920s, English-speaking, Northeastern American, broadly educated, middle-class cultural background. If you had grown up in that culture, the questions felt natural. If you hadn't, even if you were brilliant, you were starting at a deficit. This was, of course, exactly what Brigham's original Army Alpha work had been criticized for. And it was in many ways the same problem reproduced in a new test, which brings us to the genuinely surprising part of the story. In 1930, just 4 years after the SAT was first administered, Carl Brigham published a paper in the Psychological Review titled Intelligence Tests of Immigrant Groups. In this paper, he did something almost unprecedented in the history of American science. He explicitly retracted the central conclusions of his own 1923 book. He acknowledged that the Army Alpha test had been culturally biased. He acknowledged that the scores he had analyzed did not, in fact, demonstrate racial differences in innate intelligence. He acknowledged that his earlier work was, in his own words, without foundation. He went further. He called the central claim of intelligence testing, the claim that the tests measured pure native intelligence regardless of training or schooling, one of the most glorious fallacies in the history of science. He admitted that test scores were, again in his own words, a composite including schooling, family background, familiarity with English and everything else, relevant and irrelevant. It is one of the most remarkable retractions in the history of American psychology. The author of the most influential racist scientific text of the 1920s, the man whose work had been used to justify American immigration restrictions, publicly admitted that his methodology had been wrong and his conclusions unjustified. And here is the cruel irony of the entire story. Brigham's retraction had almost no effect on anything. The 1924 Immigration Act stayed in place for another 35 years. The American eugenics movement continued for at least another decade, including forced sterilization programs that affected over 60,000 Americans. The SAT, which Brigham had built in part based on his belief that intelligence could be reliably measured by standardized testing, continued to grow. The science Brigham had recanted lived on in policy. The test he had invented lived on in admissions offices. Brigham died on January 24, 1943, at age 52, of a heart attack. By the end of his life, he had become an active critic of the eugenics movement he had once championed, but the institutional structures he had helped build did not need him anymore. They were already running on their own. In 1933, Harvard University appointed a new president named James Bryant Conant. Conant was a chemist by training, brilliant, ambitious, and a reformer. He believed that Harvard had become too focused on admitting wealthy young men from elite New England prep schools. He believed America needed an aristocracy of talent. He believed there were brilliant young men in every corner of the country, in every social class, who were being overlooked by a system that admitted Harvard students based on family connections and prep school networks. Conant wanted to find these students. He wanted to give them scholarships. He wanted Harvard to be a meritocracy. This was, by 1933 standards, genuinely progressive. But Conant had a problem. How do you actually identify talent? You can't fly to every small town in America and personally interview every smart kid. You need an instrument. A standardized way to compare students from a one-room schoolhouse in Mississippi to students from Phillips Exeter Academy. You need a test. In 1933, Conant assigned two assistant deans at Harvard, Wilbur Bender and Henry Chauncey, the task of finding such a test. Bender mostly stepped aside. Chauncey took the project and ran with it. Henry Chauncey is one of the most consequential and least famous figures in American educational history. He was a square-jawed Harvard man, the son of an Episcopal minister, with deep roots in the Puritan Protestant establishment. He had been an assistant dean at Harvard, working in relative obscurity. When Conant gave him the test-finding assignment, his career changed forever. Chauncey did his research. He looked at the various standardized tests being used by different colleges and organizations, and he came back to Conant with a recommendation. In 1934, the SAT became the required test for Harvard's new scholarship program. This was the moment the SAT got its first major institutional sponsor. Harvard, the most prestigious university in America, was using the test to identify scholarship students. But Conant and Chauncey were not satisfied with just Harvard. They wanted the SAT to be national. So Chauncey began traveling, meeting with admissions officers at other elite colleges, making the case for adopting the SAT. He was, by all accounts, an extraordinary salesman. He believed deeply in the project. He sold it relentlessly. By 1938, just 5 years after Conant became Harvard president, Chauncey had convinced every single member institution of the College Board to use the SAT for scholarship applicants. By 1941, the SAT was required for all Harvard applicants, not just scholarship students. The SAT was no longer a niche test for a few colleges. It was the gateway to elite American higher education. Then World War II happened, and it accelerated everything. The College Board had historically used essay-based admissions tests for most applicants. These were tests that asked students to write extended responses to questions, requiring graders to read and evaluate each answer individually. In 1942, with the country at war and the country's resources stretched thin, the College Board suspended all of its pre-existing essay-based admissions tests. The reason was practical. They couldn't get enough graders. The SAT, which was multiple choice and could be scored by machine, became the only admissions test the College Board offered. When the war ended in 1945, the College Board could have brought back the essay tests. They didn't. The SAT was easier, cheaper, and faster to administer. The infrastructure was already in place. The institutions were already accustomed to it. The essay tests were gone for good. The post-war SAT became the Universal American College Admissions Test. In 1947, Conant began advocating for the creation of a new institution to manage standardized testing in the United States. He believed that testing was too important and too widespread to be managed by the part-time staff of the College Board. He envisioned a dedicated, professional, full-time organization that would administer the SAT, develop new tests, and serve as a kind of central nervous system for American educational measurement. On January 1, 1948, the Educational Testing Service was officially established. Conant was its first chairman of the board. Henry Chauncey, who had spent the past 15 years championing the SAT, became its first president. The Carnegie Foundation provided the initial funding. The Educational Testing Service, or ETS, is one of the strangest institutions in American life. It is technically a nonprofit, but it has revenues of over $1 billion a year. Its executives have always been paid corporate-level salaries. It operates with minimal public accountability for an organization that has, more than almost any other institution in America, shaped the educational trajectories of tens of millions of students. It is, in effect, a private monopoly that nobody ever elected, nobody ever voted for, but that has acted as the gatekeeper to American higher education for over 70 years. ETS still exists. It is still headquartered on a large campus in Princeton, New Jersey, walking distance from Princeton University where Brigham worked. It still administers the SAT, the GRE, the TOEFL, and various other tests. Its annual revenues are enormous. And most Americans have no idea what ETS is or how it operates. The growth of the SAT through the post-war decades was explosive. The GI Bill of 1944 had massively expanded American higher education. By the 1950s, the SAT was being administered to hundreds of thousands of students every year. By the 1970s, that number was in the millions. Stanley Kaplan, a Brooklyn-based tutor, had been preparing students for college entrance exams since the 1930s, and his small business grew into a national company. The Princeton Review was founded in 1981 by John Katzman. By the 1990s, SAT prep was a billion-dollar industry. Wealthy families spent thousands of dollars on tutoring. And here's where the most uncomfortable pattern of the SAT's history began to come into focus. The racial score gap. From the moment the SAT began being widely administered, certain demographic patterns showed up consistently in the results. Average SAT scores for white and Asian American students have been consistently higher than average scores for Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. This gap has persisted for decades, despite various reforms to the test, despite various interventions, despite genuine efforts to reduce bias. The causes of this gap have been the subject of furious academic debate. Some researchers have argued the gap reflects real differences in educational opportunity, with Black and Hispanic students attending under-resourced schools, having less access to test prep and academic enrichment, and living in environments that disadvantage them academically. Some have argued that the test itself remains culturally biased in subtle ways. Some have argued, controversially, that the gap reflects something innate, an argument associated most prominently with Charles Murray's 1994 book, The Bell Curve, which sparked one of the largest academic controversies of the 1990s and which has been challenged by an enormous body of subsequent research. What's clear is that the SAT, an instrument originally designed by a man who explicitly believed in racial intelligence differences, continued to produce score patterns that fit, at least superficially, those racial expectations throughout its history. Defenders of the SAT have argued the gap reflects underlying inequalities in American society, not flaws in the test. Critics have argued that the test is itself part of the problem, that it amplifies existing inequalities, that it perpetuates the exclusion of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The debate has been going on for 50 years and shows no signs of resolving. Then came 2020.
Today, the National Guard moved in to try and contain the outbreak here in New Rochelle. With large gatherings banned, schools and houses of worship closed, it seems eerily quiet.
The COVID-19 pandemic shut down standardized testing centers across the country in the spring of 2020. Hundreds of thousands of high school students were suddenly unable to take the SAT. Colleges, faced with the question of how to evaluate applicants without test scores, began making the SAT optional or even ignoring it entirely. What was supposed to be a temporary measure became, in many cases, permanent. By 2022, over 1,800 four-year colleges in the United States had adopted test-optional admissions policies. By 2024, more than 2,000 schools were test-optional or test-free. According to FairTest, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, around 80% of U.S. four-year colleges no longer required the SAT or ACT for admission. The University of California system, the largest public university system in the country, did something even more radical. They eliminated the SAT and ACT entirely from their admissions decisions. This was a genuinely historic moment in American higher education. The SAT, which had defined college admissions for nearly 100 years, was suddenly optional at the majority of American colleges. And early data on test-optional admissions suggested something uncomfortable for the test's defenders. The test's predictive power, the question of whether SAT scores actually predict college success, may have been overstated all along. Many test-optional colleges reported that students admitted without test scores performed roughly as well as those admitted with them. It looked for a few years like the SAT might be on its way out. And then, something unexpected started to happen. In March 2022, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology announced that it was reinstating the SAT requirement for its applicants. MIT was the first major selective university to do this. They argued, with internal data, that the SAT was particularly useful in identifying high-achieving students from disadvantaged backgrounds who would not otherwise stand out in the admissions process. Then, in February 2024, Dartmouth College reinstated the requirement, becoming the first Ivy League school to do so. The Dartmouth announcement was backed by a remarkable internal economic study led by Bruce Sacerdote and other Dartmouth economists. The study found that, at Dartmouth, the SAT explained roughly 22% of the variance in college grades. High school grades, by comparison, explained only 9% of the variance. Combining the two explained 25%. The SAT, despite all its flaws, was, by Dartmouth's data, the single best predictor of academic achievement they had. Yale University reinstated its testing requirement. The reversals continued. Brown, Harvard, Cornell, Princeton, Penn, Stanford. As of 2026, 9 of the 12 schools in the Ivy Plus group have reinstated standardized testing requirements. The collapse of test-required admissions has, at the most elite tier of American higher education, mostly been reversed. But here's what's important. The reversal at the elite tier has not extended to the rest of higher education. Most American colleges remain test-optional. The University of Michigan, in early 2024, declared its test-optional policy permanent. The most selective schools want test scores back. The vast middle of American higher education does not. This is the strangest moment in the SAT's 100-year history. The test created by a eugenicist in 1926, expanded by a Harvard president in 1933, universalized after World War II, monopolized by ETS in 1948, dominant for 70 years, dismantled by COVID, and now partially reconstructed by the same elite institutions that built it in the first place. And the question, the one that still has no clear answer, is what the SAT is actually for. The story of the SAT is a recurring American pattern. A test or institution gets created for one reason. It evolves to serve other reasons. It becomes universal almost by accident. It develops a constituency, an industry, an inertia that's hard to displace. And nobody, for decades, ever really stops to ask whether the original justification was good, whether the current uses are appropriate, whether the entire system makes sense. If you took the SAT in the past, I'm not telling you it was meaningless. It probably did measure something. Some studies, including the Dartmouth one, suggest it measures real and important things, but it wasn't necessarily the thing you thought it measured. The pure intelligence that Brigham originally believed in and that Conant later embraced does not exist. Test scores are, as Brigham himself eventually admitted, a composite of schooling, family background, cultural familiarity, and 100 other variables. The next time the SAT comes up in conversation, you can remember the actual story. A Princeton psychologist with deeply troubling racial views built a test based on culturally biased intelligence research from World War I. He used it to argue for racial hierarchies and immigration restriction. He later admitted his methodology was wrong. The test went on without him. A Harvard president adopted it for very different reasons. An obscure assistant dean turned it into an industry. World War II universalized it. ETS made it a monopoly. The pandemic broke it. The Ivy League is putting it back together. The strangest institutional history in American education? Now you know,